Absolutely loathed it. I always used to think the names were so sinister. Zonnerbeek, Hill 60, Zillebeek. I mean, the names terrified you before you got there. Terrible places. And then to end up at Passchendaele was the last straw, I reckon.
The village of Passchendaele is just 6 miles from Ypres. It lay 5 miles behind the German front line, on the highest of the series of gentle slopes that encircle the town. Now, thanks to the mines of Messines, the Germans had been shrugged off the shoulder of land immediately to the south. It seemed that the way was at last open to make a move, to break the salient, to push ahead. The plan had been formulated as far back as 1916. Just as the Germans cast envious eyes on the Allied ports of Calais and Boulogne, Haig was anxious to deprive the enemy of the Belgian ports of Ostend and Zeebrugge. Submarines operating from ports like these were a constant threat to ships carrying vital supplies of food and raw materials to Britain. There was no hope of capturing the ports by pushing northward along the coastline, because most of the land in that sector beyond Ypres to the sea had been deliberately flooded in 1914 to stem the German advance, and an impassable swamp divided the opposing armies. The only way was forward, break out of the salient and over the ridges, advance a few miles and swing north to bombard the ports from the rear. At the same time, specially trained troops would attack them from the sea. Haig believed that the capture of this vital area might blaze a trail that would lead the army into Germany itself and possibly end the war. On June the 17th, confident of his strategy, flushed with the victory of Messines, Haig travelled to London to attend a meeting of the War Cabinet. He was in for a nasty surprise.
Lloyd George made a long oration, minimizing the successes gained and exaggerating the strength of the enemy. His object was to induce Robertson and myself to agree to an expedition being sent to support the Italians. It was a regular lawyer's effort to make black appear white. He referred, with a sneer, to my optimistic view.
Haig might have had to bow to the War Cabinet against his own judgment had it not been for a dramatic intervention by the First Sea Lord Admiral Jellicoe. He stated his view categorically. Shipping losses had been so enormous that unless the Belgian ports could be captured, the war couldn't continue. There was also the awkward question of the French sector to the south, where some divisions had mutinied, and the situation was still weak. An attack in Flanders would keep the Germans occupied and lighten the pressure on the French. The Prime Minister wavered. In the end, he gave an ambivalent answer. They would consult the French. In the meantime, Haig was authorized to carry on with his preparations. In fact, the preparations were already far advanced. In his big staff car, speeding back from Boulogne to his headquarters at Saint-Omer, the Field Marshal passed convoy after convoy of transport and mile after mile of soldiers plodding northward to Flanders. If Lloyd George had only half decided that there ought to be a battle there, neither soldiers pouring into the back areas of the salient, nor the remaining Belgian civilians had the slightest doubt that it would take place. Least of all the parish priest of the village of Dickiebush, who recorded in his diary,
"There is more and more talk about the impending offensive. We see many extensive preparations here and learn the ones of the neighboring sectors. Additional railways are being laid all around. Guns are being brought in and the ammunition depots are being enlarged and new ones established. They must break through at any cost, and in a few short weeks Flanders will be delivered. Under the circumstances, a farmer requests permission from the military authorities to move his livestock owing to the danger of the coming offensive. Instead of obtaining this, he received a visit from the military police. What? An impending offensive? How do you know that? How dare you give away military preparations?"
The preparations were plain for all to see. By the beginning of July, the small pocket of land behind Ypres was packed with troops. Every farm became a camp, every field became a training ground, every barn a billet, every village a garrison. But there was almost a holiday atmosphere as the troops trained and practiced for the attack under the hot summer sun, and off-duty applied themselves to the business of finding enjoyment where they could.
The cafes were our only opportunity of seeing anything of life. We used to go to one in Popperinge. It was called the Café des Allies. A bottle of Bock, that's the French near beer, that cost £1. A bottle of Vin Blanc, that cost £5, an awful lot of money. But the troops would congregate in there. They'd have one or two girls serving, and a little French bloke at the piano. He knew the right tunes to play. He picked up some of the songs that the troops sang. None that I could sing here and now. They were all pretty fruity. But this was the sort of thing that the soldiers sang.
One of the calves had a piano in it, and I used to play a lot and amuse the lads. Well, I was playing away, and they were putting the glasses of vin blanc and vin rouge on the lid of the piano, and I was drinking it down. I was all right while we were inside, but when turning out time came and Mademoiselle said, "Allez," it was a different matter. When I got outside into the air, the road just started to go round and round and up and down. A couple of my mates got hold of me and took me back to the billet. I remember going up the wooden stairs into the loft among the hay, and I remember having a candle in the neck of a bottle, and I remember lying down, and drunk as I was, I remember a voice shouting up the stairs, "Put that light out." I also remember saying, "I'll put your light out if you come up here." The next minute I was under arrest. It was a sergeant major who'd called up, and he wasn't a man to stand any nonsense. I was marched up the road and thrown in the stable we used for the neck, and next morning I was up for orders. I had to go before the major, drunk on active service. He gave me a real dressing down. "I'll give you the maximum," he said. 28 days first fill punishment. The first fill punishment was no joke. It meant you had to parade in full pack and go up and down the road at the double. Everything was done at the double. About turn, left, right, about turn, left, right, left, right.
Left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. Come on, you're like a fairy marching on eggs. Swing those arms. Left, right, left, right, left, right. Come on, come on.
It was all done under the military police, and it was hard going. Because you had a full pack, tin helmet and all your stuff, sweating up and down the road. Then you took your pack off and it was up against the wagon wheel. They marched me into a field, and twice a day I was strapped up against the wagon wheel of a general service limber for an hour in the morning and an hour at night. It wasn't so much that it was uncomfortable, though you did get hot and cramped, but I just felt such a proper poppy show. All the chaps looking at you. You really felt the disgrace.
The discipline was harsh, but necessary, for this was a citizens' army. The old regular army had been virtually wiped out in 1914. The flower of Kitchener's army had been lost a year earlier on the Somme. An event which Lloyd George, fearing the disastrous effect on public opinion of another long drawn-out campaign with huge casualties, was anxious not to repeat. But now it was his turn to be surprised. The 25th of July had been set as the tentative date for the start of the offensive. On the 16th, as Lloyd George waited to welcome cabinet colleagues to dinner at Downing Street, he received the disconcerting news that the preliminary bombardment had already started. All evening the old arguments were gone over, and eventually a reluctant agreement was reached and recorded by the Secretary to the War Policy Committee.
It was decided that General Haig should be allowed to begin his offensive, but not to allow it to degenerate into a drawn-out, indecisive battle of the Somme type. If this happened, it was to be stopped, and the plan for an attack on the Italian front would be tried.
It was well after midnight when the guests left. Outside in the quiet streets, it was just possible to hear a faint drumming, like thunder in the far distance. It was the sound of the guns standing wheel to wheel 120 miles away in Flanders. Exploding in their thousands on the land beyond the salient, the shells were tossing the earth into a moonscape of hillocks and craters. Over this terrain, the infantry would have to advance. As the bombardment continues day and night, the summer begins to ebb away. thick mist drifts over the salient. The attack's postponed for 2 days, then for another 3 for the French, who are to fight on the left flank, aren't ready. 0 hour is finally fixed for 10 minutes to 4 on the morning of the 31st of July. 6 vital weeks of fine weather have passed since the capture of the Messines Ridge. Now, as 100,000 men of the Fifth Army take up their battle positions round the rim of the salient, a cool air stream's moving slowly in from the Atlantic, and there's rain on the wind. The troops are assembled in a straggling semicircle because the attack's to splay out in different directions, like the spokes of a wheel. To plunge straight ahead would simply imperil the flanks and push the army into a still deeper salient.
I went over with Sergeant McCormick. He was the greatest. He was really a hero. It was a matter of getting up to these buildings, and they were practically level, you know. The formation was all broken up in no time, getting through the barbed wire. You had to find holes for it, and that was where McCormick came in again. He kept them on. Now, boys, keep in line. Don't go past me. Keep in line. And he shouted at them. Come on now. What's wrong? Keep up. Well, we kept going under him, and the officers were pretty quiet. He was the best man, and they knew it. The machine gun was going, and you could see them firing out of the holes. Well, when I got up to the first objective, that was at 5 o'clock, we went right through it. We had to fight at the next place, really fighting. We threw away everything we had at Friesenberg. I had a rifle. Oh, I used it umpteen times. You used it until it was hot. Aye. I'd never used the bayonet, but there was supposed to be quite a lot of boys using the bayonet. Well, I saw some of our own boys getting massacred, you know, falling down. There were no officers left. We were left with just one. That was Lieutenant Burns. He got killed. He fell into my arms, dead, standing speaking to me, handing me a message at the time, and we were being swept with machine guns. We were standing in a hole up to here in water, and he fell on me. He said something about his mother. He said, "I'm all right, Mum." I picked him out of the crater and I laid him on the ground, and I shouted the moppers up to come up, and I pointed to Lieutenant Burns lying there and said, "See to him." I found only 1 or 2 of the boys, but not any of the officers. No officers. I couldn't find the sergeant. I found Lance Corporal Power, and he was the only NCO, that's all. Oh, it's fair hell, Bill. Just fair hell. That's the words he said. Everything was against us. It rained. The rain came down in torrents. The Ulster Division were in support, and the 51st Division went over before us, but in front of them was all devastating machine gun fire from the ridge. They were in full view. The 51st Division got slaughtered. As you went up, just simply a mass of dead men.
When we started off, it was hard going because you were up over your knees in the mud. But we didn't suffer any casualties till we got to Mintis Farm. And then we got a slashing there. That's where one of the boys got hit with a shell. Sliced him in 2, and the upper part of his torso gesticulated, you see, and the kilt and legs went on running. One of my blokes wanted to run and pick up the upper part of the torso, chase the legs so that he wouldn't even know he'd been hit. Join him up, that was the idea. If you stuck it together quickly, it was all right, everything joined up. But the man was beyond anybody doing anything.
The working party started going up as soon as any ground was consolidated to start laying duckboard tracks so that they could get supplies up to the front line. And of course, during that time, we saw quite a lot of wounded coming down. That was our first experience of what was happening. It gave us a foretaste of what we might be in for ourselves at a later stage. And I recollect one party coming down consisting of German and British soldiers all walking wounded. I said, "What's it like up there?" He got rather curious, you know. And one said, "It's a bloody slaughterhouse." I can remember him saying that now.
The pouring rain that turned the shell-shattered ground into a quagmire wasn't the only stumbling block. Even before the rain came on, after the first optimistic news of successes and captured objectives had reached Fifth Army headquarters, messages of a more disturbing nature began to trickle through. For apart from a few well-placed fortifications and machine gun posts, the Germans regarded their forward lines as mere outpost positions. Their real defences lay further back. Concealed by the folds of the first low ridges, they'd built a fortress of concrete pillboxes. After the initial capture of the first thinly held German lines, the infantry was shocked to discover that it was storming a citadel. The attack ground to a halt. The rain teemed down, and there was no possibility of reliefs getting up. Hunched in the open under the streaming skies, or if they were lucky and captured dugouts, the troops sheltered as best they could from the rain and the shell fire and waited for the next move.
We got into a pillbox we'd taken. It was only meant for 2 or 3 men, but we managed to squeeze in 5 or 6. We took turns to squat in it for a bit, then we'd crawl outside and let some of the other fellows in. We had blokes wounded, badly wounded. We'd laid them on jerry duckboards because we'd no stretchers, but this entrance to the pillbox was so small we couldn't get the duckboards through. So there was nothing for it but to cover the men with ground sheets and lay them on the open ground in the shelter of the back wall of the pillbox and post a sentry there to keep an eye on them. Then there was a lull in the shelling, and through the machine gun slit on the back wall of the pillbox, we heard this terrible kind of gargling noise. There was the wounded lying there sinking, and this liquid mud burying them alive, running over their faces and into their mouth and nose. We had to keep heaving the duckboards up and trying to put some other stuff underneath just so that the fellows wouldn't sink so much. We couldn't understand why, in the name of God, anyone had ordered an attack like that over terrain like that.
We heard very little news as the battle went on. Of course, we were at the transport line, and our job was to go up the same night after dark to whatever position they'd occupied and deliver the rations for the next day. Well, the mud was so bad up there that normally rations would go up on limbers. We had to take them up in panniers on pack mules. And when we got to what had been the first German line, the officer in charge of the transport said, "Well, this is as far as I can take my mules. I'm dumping the rations here." Well, there were 4 company quartermaster sergeants. We decided that 2 should go forward to try and find the battalion. 1 should stay with the rations, and the other should try and find brigade headquarters to get some instructions as to where the battalion might be. We tossed up for these different jobs, and it fell to my lot to find brigade headquarters, so I set off to find it. They were established in an underground German concrete pillbox just in front of St. Julian. I went down the stairs, saluted the brigadier, told him who I was, explained the position, and I said, "Could you give me any instructions, sir, that would help me find the battalion?" I remember him standing on those steps. This pillbox was rocking like a boat in rough sea from the heavy explosions. And he just looked at me and he said, "I'm sorry, Quarters. I'm afraid there isn't any Hertfordshire regiment left."
The Times, Wednesday, August the 1st, 1917.
Story of the battle. Good beginning. First day's objectives achieved.
Main British attack has been launched on a front of about 8 miles round the circuit of the Ypres Salient. It was an extremely difficult attack. It must be remembered that the salient is like a saucer, with the low ground in the flat centre and the high rim all round. The main depth of our advance is between 3,000 and 4,000 yards. It is precisely what it was meant to be. Neither more nor 1 yard less.
But the truth was that the army was stuck in the mud. The rain continued to teem down as if some malevolent deity had opened a tap in the heavens. The mud turned to soup. Neither fresh troops nor supplies could be got up, and until they could, there was no possibility of advancing further. In some parts of the line, on the higher ground, where the original objectives hadn't been reached on the first day, it would be feasible to mount local attacks to try again. But in the main, until the weather improved, there was nothing for it but to wait and face the pitiless bombardment of shelling and counterattack.
I'm a little wet hole in a trench, where the rainstorms continually drench. There's a dead mule nearby, with her legs towards sky, and she gives off an oriole stench. Underneath me, instead of a floor, there's a mess of some mud and some straw. But with shells falling there, why no place can compare.
conditions were such that it was quite impossible to tell where there was any sort of line. But there wasn't any sort of line. There were little parties, little groups of men in shell holes, and you started off here on a shell hole. You knew where it was on your map, and you took a bearing with a compass. There was no wire or anything to show you, you see. You couldn't put up any wire. It was quite a mess.
We had to try to get the supplies up, rations and ammunition. Directly it was getting dusk, you could hear the wagon wheels starting on these cobbles, coming up and gradually getting louder and louder on the straight road right into Ypres. And then old Jerry would open up with his long-range guns and he'd drop them down on the corner where he knew he'd got the range. And he dropped them. One there, one there, and one there. All night long that went on, until it started the daylight. The road was absolutely a shambles with blood and gore and bits of horses, wagons with no wheels on, turned on their side, rations strewn right across the road. It was awful, really awful. And our orders were to shoot the drivers if they refused to stop so we could divide them up, so there was spaces in between, you see. Well, directly they started to close up, it only wanted a shell to drop on one and they'd all get it. They did panic, you see. You get 4 mules in the front of a GS wagon and these things coming over, shrapnel up above, HEs down below, and the noise, deafening. And horses getting killed and legs cut off, screaming. Of course, the drivers whipping them up, wanting to get away, get off the road, get away from it as quick as they can. Naturally. It's only human nature, isn't it? Want to get away out of that as fast as you can. Our job was to stop them. It was a rotten job. Fear? You got to be in it to understand what it means. Really. Fear is any moment to be blown to smithereens. Those shells coming over, one after another, screeching, one after another. The next move was the 16th of August. There were little raids and that kind of thing while we were consolidating the line, but our next big move was the 16th of August. The Ulster Division got in the front line. Hardly anything was gained. The Germans weren't in trenches, they were in pillboxes. And the result was that our attack on the 16th was an utter failure with an awful lot of slaughter. As a matter of fact, I got leave the next day and went to Port Rush, and I could see people there enjoying themselves whose brothers and sons were lying dead because it wasn't announced, you see. Oh, they announced it, but they didn't give the names, just that they had attacked, you see.
I was ordered to support the tanks, and I decided the best way to support them was to put a smokescreen down. I went up to the observation post and I put down 1 or 2 smoke shells to see that the smoke was drifting the right way, and I got a lovely smoke screen right across so the Germans couldn't see the tanks. Then the tanks crossed over by St. Julian and they got bogged down. Well, of course, the people above hadn't realized the conditions. General Fuller, he wasn't a general then, but he was staff officer of the tank brigade. Because he thought tanks might be used in the battle, he drew up a map showing the bombed areas and the flooded areas all marked in blue. He showed it to me after the war. He went up to the chief intelligence officer, Charteris, GHQ, with this map and said, "Will you please show this to the commander-in-chief?" General Charteris was, I think, misleading Haig on a lot of points, and he said, "I refuse to show that to the commander-in-chief because it would depress him." And there we were. He was trying to lead Haig on all the time. Go on attacking in these conditions. Well, I'd been there at the observation post and seen our poor infantry trying to struggle through the bog to their objectives. I could see them stuck there, couldn't get on. And I'm told that the Germans opposite were preparing to come out and surrender. Because our infantry couldn't get on, the Germans went back into their shell holes and started shooting them. I could see them struggling like blazes, up to their knees in mud. They could hardly move.
It was to be another 5 weeks before the soldiers managed to fight their way across that narrow patch of land, the depth of 2 fields, between St. Julian and the Zonnebeek-Langmark Road. On the 18th, General Gough, commander of the 5th Army, drove south to Haig's headquarters and asked him to stop the offensive. But the commander-in-chief was under pressure from other directions, not least from the French, as he revealed, although in retrospect, 10 years later. He still believed that once the troops broke out of the slough and won the ridges, conditions would improve. It was still possible that the Belgian ports could be captured in September. There was no alternative but to continue. The men were being splendid. He was convinced that they could do it.
I think that the morale of the British Army was possibly at its lowest ebb. We'd had a spell of fine weather. We felt on top of the world. This is the time to get cracking, as it were. But as soon as it rained cats and dogs, it always seemed to coincide with the decision to make an advance. And it had a most depressing effect on the troops.
One night we were in bell tents. We had to dig a hole inside the tents to protect us from splinters or shells or bombs bursting. They were about 18 inches deep. Then there was a tremendous storm, and before we could move, those trenches or holes inside the tents were filled with water, with all our clothes, blankets, and everything. We had to rescue what we could. Well, one guardsman, his tent blown away, his clothes in that pool of water, stood on the edge of the hole just in his shirt that was wet through and sang the doxology, "Praise God from whom all blessings flow." Blasphemous, I think, but I think God smiled. And he had a tremendous voice. You could hear him all over the place.
Blessings flow, praise him, all creatures here below. Praise him above, ye heavenly hosts. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen.
When I took a church parade, I insisted that the men should realize that they were doing the right thing, that they were out to protect the right, and we had a good cause. But I felt I wasn't making as much sacrifice as the men, and I was the person who was talking the most about sacrifice, you see. There was one thing I heard another padre say which always stuck with me, and it was this. I'm not going to say, "God be with you men in the trenches," for I am at the transport lines. I always thought of that. My battalion was on these duckboards, and I was just one of them. I found my way to a pillbox which was being used as an aid post, and of course that's where the padre should be. If he can do any good in a special way, if a man happens to be dying, he should give him comfort. I remember one padre saying to me, "Don't you run away with the idea that a man can't understand if he's unconscious, because," he said, "if you whisper in a man's ear, it sometimes penetrates right down." So I did that. Put your trust in God, I used to say.
I think whether we were in the line or out of it, there was a philosophy somewhere which made us think that if your name was on it, you'd had it. But there was no point in worrying, and comradeship was such that it didn't matter what your circumstances were. If there were 3 or 4 of you together, you were still able to say something or do something. I don't think we bothered to think too deeply in those days. We trusted our NCOs and our officer personnel. Well, that's something I think all troops would have said.
We had a man they called the Mascot, a man called Shuttleworth. He was a very awkward soldier. We came up that night, I was leading the platoon, and there was a hold-up at the back. My sergeant, Hull, came up, and he said, "It's the Mascot, sir. He wants to fall out. He can't go any further." I said, "Come on." I got hold of him myself, and he was moaning all the way. "I can't go on. I've done my bit in this war. I can't go on any more." I was cursing him. I cursed him without stopping for 2.5 hours. I called him everything I could think of, names I'd never even thought of before. There was this piece of barbed wire that everybody else had avoided. Shuttleworth fell over it. If it was a shell hole, everybody else would have skirted it. Shuttleworth fell into it. "Oh," he said, "I can't go on any further. I can't." Every time I called him a fresh word or name, of course it got back to the platoon. Tickled them to pieces, made them laugh. It served a dual purpose, you see. It kept the platoon in good spirits, and it also kept him going across the duckboard track. I said, "There you are, you see. It isn't your legs that are wrong. It's your guts, my boy. That's what your trouble is, you know." But he came to a perfect end. That was in October, the end of October. We were lying pinned down somewhere, and there was a distinct noise of laughter. I said, "What is it?" "It's the Mascot, sir. He's shot in the arse."
When this bloody war is over, oh, how happy I will be when I get my civic clothes on. No more soldiering for me. No more sleeping in the trenches. No more asking for a pass. You
correspondents were fond of filing stories about battalions of cheerful Tommies singing on the march, but they seldom pointed out that it was the soldiers marching out of the line, away from the battle, who were doing all the singing. And now that weary, blood-stained August had dragged to a close, there were 2 weeks of blessed respite while preparations went on for the next attack. The rain stopped. The fighting troops were relieved. There was leave for the lucky, and for the others, the happy prospect of a few days' rest. And even if the word rest had an ironic ring about it, no matter how rough the fatigues and drill, you wouldn't end up on a casualty list, and that, after all, was something to sing about.
When you're living in the trenches where we've been, the Boche may be heard but he's seldom seen. You go on patrol in the dickens of a funk, you lie in the hole that a sailor sunk. You sink up a tale to tell the boss, you reckon you deserve the military cross. You say that you cut the old barbed wire, and everybody says you're a bloody liar.
Oh, what a life, living in a trench. Oh, what a life, fighting with the French. We haven't got a wife or a pretty little wench, but everybody's happy in the old French trench.
Everybody's happy, everybody's glad. It's the 17th bloody shell we've had. Whiz-bang, call box, shrapnel saw, and the blinking mine underneath the floor.
Oh, what a life, living in a trench. Oh, what a life, fighting with the French. We haven't got a wife or a pretty little wench, but everybody's happy in the old French trench.
It always used to bring the house down. It was so typical of what we had to go through, but somehow making a joke of it when you knew you had to go back to it made it all just bearable.
The bombardment that preceded the next push started on the 15th of September and thundered on for 5 days. The troops moved into battle positions. This time the Second Army was to join forces on the right of the exhausted Fifth, and the Australians, fighting fit and fresh from a long rest, were to help in the attack on the bastion of Zonnebeek. From there, the road led straight to Passchendaele and over the ridge. To get even that far, the cost had been enormous. And over the grisly strip of land that separated St. Julian from the Zonnebeek landmark road, the troops who had crawled out in front of the line to wait for zero were crouched among the mangled remains of the men who'd been killed in the 3 previous assaults.
Most of my boys were young Londoners, just 18 or 19, and a lot of them were going into a fight for the first time. The stench was horrible, for the bodies were not corpses in the normal sense. With all this shell fire and bombardments, they'd been continually disturbed, and the whole place was a mess of filth and slime and bones and decomposing bits of flesh. Everyone was on edge, and I could hear a boy sobbing and crying. He was crying for his mother. It was pathetic, really. He just kept saying over and over again, "Oh, Mum, oh, Mum." Nothing would make him shut up, and while it wasn't likely that the Germans could hear, it was quite obvious that when there were lulls in the shell fire, the men in the shell holes on either side would hear this lad and possibly be affected. Well, depression, even panic, can spread quite easily in a situation like that. So I crawled over to the shell hole and asked Corporal Merton what was going on. He said, "It's his first time in the line, sir. I can't keep him quiet, and he's making the other lads jittery." I tried to reason with the boy, but the more I talked to him, the more distraught he became. So I switched my tactics. Called him a coward, threatened him with the court-martial, and when that didn't work, I simply pulled him towards me and slapped his face as hard as I could. It had an extraordinary effect. There was absolute silence in the shell hole. And then the corporal, who was a much older man, said, "I think I can manage him now, sir." Well, he took that boy in his arms, just as if he was a small child. And when I crawled back a little later to see if all was well, they were both lying there asleep, and the corporal still had his arms round the boy, mud, accoutrements and all. At 0 hour, they went over together.
They called the fighting of that week the Battle of the Menin Road, and by the standards which had been set since the campaign began on the 31st of July, it was a success. The army had managed to climb halfway up the ridges and conquer the bloody stumps of the fortified woods and copses which had repelled them so many times. It had also managed to cross the graveyard of its soldiers in front of St. Julian and batter its way across the shattered cobbles of the Zonnebeek landmark road. Lieutenant Angel was severely wounded in that attack. The boy he'd slapped received multiple gunshot wounds and went home to Mum. Corporal Merton, who comforted him, was killed by the same burst of fire and never went home at all. But the line had been advanced, and in places by up to a mile. In the eyes of the High Command, it was good. But it was not quite good enough, for there was now no question of a breakout from the salient before the high autumn tides and the onset of winter would make the plan of attack on the Belgian ports impossible. On the 23rd, this project, which had been twice postponed, was finally cancelled. It was almost October, and the battle had now been in progress for 2 long months. The rains had set in again. The troops had managed to get halfway to the Passchendaele Ridge, and 89,000 of their comrades had been killed or wounded on the way.
I saw the dead wherever I looked. A dead signaller still clinging to a basket cage with 2 dead pigeons in it. And further on, lying just off the track, 2 stretcher bearers with a dead man on a stretcher. There was the remains of a ration party that had been blown off the track. I remember seeing an arm still holding on to a water container.
I had an unofficial batman once when I was made sergeant. It didn't matter where you went, where you were fighting, he said he'd make a cup of tea. There you are, Tommy. A drop of tea, he'd say. I'll tell you what happened. He said, I've made the tea, Tom. So I had this tea. Next morning, we looked over the side where he got the water, and it was a bleeding shell hole, and there was a German in it, blood and all. And we had that and all in our tea. Well, we'd had it the night before, so we didn't worry about it today. No ill effects.
You got this Ypres Canal. I can't explain it, but you got a funny feeling when you crossed that bridge. You'd sort of abandon hope. As you got further out, you got this awful smell of death. Whatever people like to say, you could smell it. It was so different to what it was a couple of years before when I was up there as an infantryman. Oh, yes, when I saw the salient in 1917, God, yes, I wept. It was dreadful. We just felt, well, I hope I get a blighty one to get out of it. As I say, you got that feeling. You could smell it crossing the canal. The sweet smell of death in patches.
When the dead men were just muddy mounds by the trackside, it was not so bad. They were somehow impersonal. But what was unendurable were the bodies with upturned faces. Sometimes the eyes were gone, and the faces were like skulls with the lips drawn back, as if they were looking at you with terrible amusement.
I want to go home. I want to go home. I don't want to go in the trenches no more, where with spanks and shrapnel they whistle and roar. Take me back over the sea, where the alley men can't get at me. Oh my, I don't want to die, I want to go home.
Now they'd started to talk of Passchendaele as the sole objective. Passchendaele, which in his original plan of attack Haig had hoped to sweep across in a matter of days. Passchendaele entrenched behind a curtain of seemingly ceaseless rain, protected by concrete outposts manned by crack troops. Passchendaele across a shallow valley dominated by pillboxes, where the sectors were ominously named on the trench maps, water fields and marsh bottom. The rain turned into a storm of howling gale-force winds and lashing torrents that showed no signs of abating. Generals Gough and Plumer jointly recommended that the campaign should be brought to an immediate close. Haig refused to entertain the idea. Plans had already been made for a fresh attack on the 9th. The bad weather might clear up at any moment. Statistics supplied by intelligence indicated that the Germans were almost at their last gasp. Now we had the Anzacs, and the Canadians were coming. The army could hardly be expected to establish a line in a swamp for the winter. The high ground at Passchendaele was at last within reach, and from it they would be in a splendid position to break through in the spring. It needed just one final effort to reach it. 30 hours later, the troops were on their way, shuffling up the long miles of sodden duckboard tracks towards the starting point in the valley that lay at the foot of Passchendaele Ridge.
It took us more than 12 hours to get there, a distance of just about a mile. We started off just after 5 in the evening, and as soon as it got dark, Jerry started to shell the track with shrapnel and high explosive. It was a howling gale, and the rain came down in torrents. Often we had to stop and wait for up to half an hour because the duckboards were being blown up and men were being blown off the track or simply slipping off. Because we were all in full marching order with gas masks and rifles, and some were carrying machine guns and extra ammunition. So, of course, an explosion or just the slightest thing would knock a man off balance, and he went off the track and right down into the mud. Of course, we were late. We heard the covering barrage opening at 5 o'clock, and we weren't in position for another quarter of an hour. Colonel Whitehead just gave me the order, and over we went into this morass, straight into a curtain of rain and mist and shell fire, because the Germans had started shooting back and we were caught between the two barrages. I realized that the position was absolutely hopeless. I got a handful of men together and took them into a big crater more than half full of water. We filled some of the empty sandbags we got with slush and put them on the edge as a base for the Lewis gun so we could try to protect our position. And there we stayed. We were there for more than 24 hours. And the rain and the shelling never stopped the whole time.
Just beyond that shell hole, up a gentle slope to the half-right, was the village of Passchendaele. It was to take the troops 26 more days to get there. In the end, it was the Canadians who did it. Helped by the Anzacs on the opposite side of the valley, they attacked up the slightly higher ground on the flanks.
The infantry attacked early in the morning of the 26th. As the companies advanced, there was terrific machine gun fire. It came from the front and the flanks, and it swept right over them. We replied until our guns were hot.
It started to rain again in the afternoon, but it went well that day. Although the shelling and the fighting was the fiercest I've ever seen, even at Vimy Ridge. Eventually we stopped at the foot of a lane leading into the village. You could tell it had been a lane by the ruined cottages on either side. There was a place they called Crest Farm. We had to fight as we'd never fought to take it. The place was filled with bodies, but we took it and we held the line. 2 days later, we were relieved.
The 78th Winnipeg Fusiliers had actually thrown some forward patrols into Passchendaele. But the final assault could only succeed if fresh troops were brought in. They waded up to the line, relieved their exhausted comrades, and on the 6th of November went for Passchendaele. For once, it wasn't raining.
On my way to morning mass at 6 a.m., I suddenly saw a very bright light, and a few seconds later, hundreds and hundreds of flashes interspersed with shrapnel and many red and white rockets. All the same, I heard little noise, as the wind was in the wrong direction. And had I not seen that hellish fire, I would hardly have believed that an attack was underway.
By the time Father Van Follingham had returned from Mass and was sitting over his bowl of coffee in the presbytery at Dickiebush, the first of the Canadians had penetrated the German defences and were entering the ruins of Passchendaele village. From the jumping-off line of the 31st of July, it was just 5 miles to Passchendaele. It had taken the troops exactly 99 days and 3 hours to get there. Of nearly 1 million men who'd taken part in the campaign, 250,000 had become casualties.
The bodies of our men were piled up all over the place. By midday, we'd lost 2 machine guns out of our section of 4. By halfway through the afternoon, we'd lost 2 men of our own team of 6. By morning, only my buddy Toombs and I were left. Then came the burst that got Toombs. It got him right in the head. His blood and his brains, pieces of skull, lumps of hair spattered all over the front of my greatcoat.